So hi everybody, thank you very much for coming along today. My name is Dr. Eve Hayes de Calaf and I'm currently a visiting fellow here at the Institute of Modern Languages Research. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting this relaunch of the CLACS Caribbean Studies Seminar Series. I'm co-hosting this alongside my colleague Jack Webb, who is part of the Race, Roots and Resistance Collective at the University of Manchester. Sadly, Jack can't be with us today due to teaching commitments, but he's been working tirelessly with me behind the scenes to organise today's event and two more seminars that we have due to take place in November and December. So this seminar series, as I understand it, has taken many forms over the years. Dr. Adam Philogene-Heron helpfully reminded us recently that numerous leading Caribbean scholars have presented papers at the what was the then Caribbean Postgraduate Seminar Series throughout the 1980s and 1990s at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and also formerly the Institute of Latin American Studies here at the University of London. So many of these speakers were pioneers in the field, including names such as Shirley Gordon, Gad Hoyman, Jean Besson, who I think I saw on the call, welcome, Seymour Drescher, Glenroy Tate, Bridget Jones, and to name but a few. There are many, many more. So we really are standing on the shoulders of giants today, and we would not be here without these great scholars. So the papers from that series are still online, and I'm going to put some links then in the chat for you should you wish to access these. So our plan then, what Jack and I have done today, is we want to really carry on this legacy, but in a digital format. So what we're going to do today is record a video of this and the future talks as part of this series. And please look out for those on the IMLR website in the not too distant future. We've got two more events for you to register for. On the 16th of November, Dr. Jake Sir Brian Richards from LSE will be presenting his paper, The Warfare Origins of the Anti-Slave Trade Legal Regime in the Atlantic World, with Adam Philogene-Heron at Goldsmiths chairing. And then on the 7th of December, we welcome Dr. Kessewa John of the UCL Institute of the Americas, who will be presenting Papers for the People, the Radical Press of the Late Colonial Caribbean, with Zakia Mackenzie from Exeter chairing that. So as I said, we'll be putting the links in the chat and look out for those. We've organised these seminars to actively promote intellectual engagement and knowledge exchange on interdisciplinary, comparative and integrated research on the Caribbean, and as broadly conceptualised as that may be in its many forms. So we're prioritising this as a space principally for postgraduate students and early career researchers. If you want to give your own talk or you want to invite another academic to speak for you to chair that session, please do let us know. Tell us what you want to do and we'll do our best to accommodate. We're still putting together the series from January 2022, so we welcome any proposals, ideas or suggestions you might have about upcoming events. So reach out to us. I'll put my email in the chat for you and send us a title, abstract and a bio. Yeah, we'll do our best then, and hopefully we can really start a really exciting seminar series. So without further ado, I'll pass the reins over to our chair for today, Shodona Kettle, who is from UCL Institute of the Americas, and she is going to introduce our first speaker and paper for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eve. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to everyone. I'm really excited to be chairing this inaugural lecture to kick off the Caribbean Studies Seminar Series at CLACS. As Eve mentioned, I'm Shodona Kettle, Chair of the Haiti Support Group and a PhD student at the Institute of the Americas, UCL. So as current Chair of the Haiti Support Group, it's my pleasure to share that Professor Scheller has been involved with us since the 1990s, when she accompanied members of the HSG to Haiti, doing a study tour in 1997. And this, in fact, was her first visit to Haiti, as well as introduction to the progressive grassroots movement. Now, Professor Scheller is inaugural dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. Until July of this year, 2021, she was Professor of Sociology, Head of the Sociology Department, and Founding Director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. She is founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities and past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility. She helped to establish the new mobilities paradigm and is considered to be a key theorist in critical mobilities research and in Caribbean studies. She serves on the international advisory boards for the Society for Caribbean Research and the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. The Bauman Institute at the University of Leeds, the Asia Mobilities Research Network at Konkuk University in South Korea, and the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. Professor Scheller has published more than 125 articles and book chapters and is the author or co-editor of 15 books, including Advanced Introduction to Mobilities, Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene, Mobility Justice, The Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes, Aluminium Dreams, The Making of Light Modernity, Citizenship from Below, Erotic Agency and Caribbean Freedom, Consuming the Caribbean, From Arawaks to Zombies, and Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasant Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica. So, Professor Scheller will speak for around 45 minutes, after which there will be time for questions. Please do make use of the chat function to pose your comments or questions. If you would like to ask a live question, please use the raise hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And please do note that this event is being recorded, so if you wish to remain anonymous and you would like to ask a question, you can write directly to me and I will read your question out for you. So without further ado, we look forward to listening to a Revindication of Haitian Futures Beyond Disaster Discourses. Professor Scheller, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shodona, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I want to especially thank the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for organizing this event, to Eve and Jack for inviting me, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I would also like to thank all the support staff who I know are working in the background to keep us all going on Zoom here. And I'm also going to begin by also thanking the Haiti Support Group and the work the group has done over the years. And I know Eve has been very involved in that over the last decade. And back in the 1990s, when I got involved, Charles Arthur was helping lead it. Leah Gordon, of course, over many years has helped keep it going. And so many thanks to all of you. Here in the audience, I'm thrilled to see so many names I recognize again from decades of work, your work on Haiti that I've read and learned from, and the wider Caribbean. So I see, I'll give a shout out, Jean Besson, Paul Sutton, Maria Cristina Fumagalli, Kate Quinn, Rachel Douglas, and Leah, who I've already mentioned. All of your work has helped teach me and inform me in my own sort of journey in this field. So without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and what I will be doing today is I'm not going to be reading a formal paper as such. I decided I want to approach this by talking to you directly and telling stories, and then I hope that will lead to a great period of conversation that we can have, because I think I have as much to learn from all of you as you might from what I have to say. And so I'm calling, I wrote this title at the moment when Haitian migrants were arriving at the US-Mexico border, Del Rio, Texas, and there was such a sense of impending, doom and disaster, which comes up again and again and again in the US kind of coverage of Haiti and the situation there and what people are going through there. And I wanted to sort of take that disaster discourse, as well as work I've done on post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, and really turn it more towards the positive, right? Towards a revindication of Haitian futures, because we hear so often that there is no future, right? That it's ended. And so I think it's really important for us to hold on to appreciative analysis and understanding of what we gain and what we learn from the Haitian past, present, and futures, which I hope to lead us towards. And I'm going to begin, as I do in my book on Island Futures, with a preface, which is about the autobiography of my mother, who passed away in 2018, but who was such an influence on my introduction to thinking about Haiti, because she was very much an activist in the anti-war and peace movements, in democracy movements and women's movements in the US, but looking at the implications of our policy of US impact across Central America in particular in the 1980s and across the wider Caribbean region. And these are some of her t-shirts from a show she did for her 70th birthday, which was called My Life in T-Shirts. And she hung up all these T-shirts on a laundry line, and there was, decades of protest movements, and the T-shirts that she got at them or wore to those protests and had saved over the years. And it was an autobiography of a kind of life of political engagement. And, the thing informing this was the US wars in, El Salvador, Nicaragua, the funding of the Contras, the, all the money and weaponry that this country put into suppressing popular and socialist and people's movements across this hemisphere. And the story of Haiti is also caught up in that history. So for me, I kind of came of political age in the 1980s and was aware of all of this going on. And that was the perspective from which I came to an interest in Haiti, which is through women's movements, and in particular through Caribbean women's movements or Caribbean feminisms. And I just grabbed this screenshot here because it had a handy set of pictures. It's from the blackwomenradicals.com blog. And it's a collage of people like Gloria Joseph, Edwige Danticat, Sarah Gomez, Audre Lorde, Una Marson, Andai, Jamaica Kincaid, Maryse Condé, June Jordan, Claudia Jones, etc. And it's just a reminder to me of all the radical women political thinkers who have come before us in the Caribbean and kind of defined the resistance of the region to colonialism, to US imperialism, but not just the resistance, the alternative visions, right? The visions for a different kind of future. So that's what inspires me. That's what keeps me going. So in my book, Island Futures, I actually begin with this letter I found in my mother's files that was, she was secretary for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, local branch in Germantown in Philadelphia. And in 1994, they were visited by Haitian activists and were inspired to, write letters to try to influence US policy in the region. And so she wrote this letter that was published in a very small, local newspaper. And it was about the history of Haiti and the US relation to Haiti. And it's about the 1915 occupation for 19 years, which left a legacy of economic exploitation, decimation of thousands of resisting farmers, that is, 15,000 people were killed in the periods of the Kako Rebellion against the US occupation. It left a weakened civil society, and it left a proxy army known as the Haitian Armed Forces. And she writes in this letter, the US has consistently used political, economic, and military means to suppress Haitian democratic efforts. US funding supported the dictatorships of the Duvaliers, and then in this period that she's writing, 1990s, of Raul Cedras, money channeled through USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy financed projects and candidates that co-opted progressive grassroots organizations. And she writes about how key US economic and political institutions have had an interest in protecting the low-wage export platform that Haiti became at that time, right, as part of the sort of policies around structural adjustment and what would be funded through these kind of export processing zones. And then she goes on to talk about Aristide winning the election on a revolutionary platform that preached against exploitation of workers and defied politically protected drug cartels, and that he was undermined by Washington at that time, which continued to support the Haitian military and the opposition. And in this period, it was after, the coup of September 30th, 1991, the installment of these coup leaders, et cetera, and how, interestingly, a US embassy statement called reports of human rights violations exaggerated, although there was documentation that over 3,000 Aristide supporters had been killed. And at the time in the 1990s, it said she wrote, this embassy statement was in support of a policy that considered fleeing Haitians economic refugees to be sent back immediately. And I read this and I think about the echoes of what's going on today. I think about the parallels, right? The repetition of this cycle. And yet the US media, the news agencies all repeat this cycle of, Haiti's dysfunctional and it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, et cetera, what's wrong with Haiti? And continues these policies that send refugees back without even processing asylum requests and so on. And it's like the same story again, without the recognition of our involvement in it. So I just come to this talk, as not even, I haven't even been in Haiti that much recently, right? I don't consider myself like the deepest, most knowledgeable expert on Haiti in the room, but I consider myself involved in this cycle of US politics. And I'm a US citizen, right? I'm born here. So it's my country and my government that I want to take responsibility for in the stories that I want to tell today. So we fast forward to September 2021, the horrific images of the US border agents on horses, stopping Haitians from reaching the border, cursing and whipping them with the reins, 14,000 people, many with young children, forced to camp under a highway overpass. Many of those people we know were not coming directly from Haiti. These are people who we've learned have been living in Brazil and Chile and other Latin American countries since the earthquake of January 2010, when many people did leave Haiti because they were welcomed into Latin American countries to work there. The Biden administration has deported thousands of these people directly back to Haiti, which, as we know, is in the midst of a political crisis, but both before and after the assassination of President Jovenel Moise on July 7th of this year. So I just sort of summarize this briefly to highlight that it is US policy in Latin America and the whole Caribbean region and at our borders that is in crisis and is in violation of international law. It's not Haiti's crisis, it's our crisis. It's our crisis of humanitarian reception, it's our breaking of international law, and it's over decades that this situation has been developing. And there's a kind of vacuum of any kind of more positive policy action towards the entire region. And so that is also the context in which I'm thinking today. So that was just my preface. And there's 3 parts to my talk, and I'll begin with the myth of Haiti as a failed state, which I place, of course, over the striking and horrific image of the National Palace collapsed in the earthquake of 2010, which is, kind of symbolic of the failure of the Haitian state. So as Shodona mentioned at the beginning, I first visited Haiti in 1997 with the Haiti Support Group. And so it was, that period of my mother's political activism, interest in Central America, interest in US policy that led me to an interest in what was happening in Haiti at that time. And accompanied this group led by Charles Arthur. And we were introduced to these amazing grassroots movements. We met and spoke with Chauvin Jean-Baptiste of Tête Collée Paysanne Haïtienne. We met with members of the Mouvement Paysan de Papaye. We met Camille Chalmers of La Plateforme Haïtienne de Plaidoyer pour un Développement Alternatif. We met Rosanne Auguste of the Carrefour Fay Women's Health Clinic. And what strikes me in looking back at this, it's almost 25 years ago, is that when I returned to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, many of these leaders were still organizing civil society resistance and still were, critiquing what was happening and still had alternative platforms. And, at the time of the earthquake, we often heard the media here in the US said, there is no civil society in Haiti, right? It is failed, it is collapsed, everything is like falling apart. And yet I knew that these kinds of organizations proliferated, existed, may have had, disagreements with each other and so on. But the notion that Haiti needed rescue because they didn't have a civil society was extremely problematic and was erasing the organizations and the work that had been there for decades, right? And we're still there. And so when I go back and think about what I learned at that time in 1997, in an interview with leaders of Tête Collée Paysanne, which was actually published in this anthology that came out, they said, we want a state that is not a puppet of the Blancs. By this, we mean foreign powers. Blancs means the US government, the World Bank, the IMF, all enforcing their own economic and political plans on the world. We want a state that really welcomes participation of the popular masses in real power. We want democratic participation in its real essence, not demagogy and intimidation. And at that time, I was working on my PhD dissertation, which was about peasant democratization movements in Haiti in the 19th century and in Jamaica. Right? I was looking at the 1830s, the 1840s, and they were saying the same things, right, in 1997. And that is what I recognized, was that it was these grassroots and small farmer movements that were the strongest advocates of democratization, that were leading democratization movements, and from the 19th century into the 20th century. And then also I heard echoed in interviews with people in 2010 talking about the response to the earthquake and the recovery efforts. And they literally said, this was one interviewee said, all the Blancs should leave, all the foreign NGOs should go. And this was just months after the earthquake, right, in March, when everybody was like, oh, we're bringing all this aid, we're going to do all these things, we're going to build back better. So the critique was still there, alive and well. So in thinking about this longer history of Haiti's positioning in the world and how it gets represented, I came to sort of echo the many analysts, many of you, including some of you here in this room, who have written about the debt that is owed, not by Haiti, the debt that is owed to Haiti. And in 2004, Aristide had presented a $22 billion bill for reparations to the French government based on the indemnity that was extracted from the Haitian National Treasury from 1825 to 1893. And it was in the 1890s that Haiti's treasury, that is its gold reserves, were placed under direct supervision of the French Société Générale and were literally moved to vaults on Wall Street via the National City Bank, that is today's Citibank. They took the gold and they brought it to Wall Street, and they said Haiti needs to keep paying back its debt. And so that huge extraction of wealth over all those years, we know about that, we understand that. And the efforts that were to ensure a collection of a $500,000 payment from Haiti's National Bank led directly to the 1914 US occupation. And those Haitian debts to American banks were not paid off until 1947. And so anytime you hear that tagline, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, you need to tell this story, right? This story is where the money went. And this perpetual debt is echoed, again, we see not just in Haiti, but for example, in Puerto Rico's $74 billion debt or plus, and the ongoing political struggles over disaster aid and the funding of rebuilding after hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. And we see this debt story, in other places. And I also put here a reminder of a great Haiti briefing, which, if you haven't followed and seen the work of the Haiti Support Group for many years, they published these Haiti briefings, which now I understand, are still being done online. And this one was called Haiti's Hunger Games. It's from 2012, about disastrous food policy that bites the hands that feed. And I think probably many of us are familiar with the way in which World Bank and IMF food policies undermined the Haitian rural economy. And I won't go into the details on that, but that's an important part of this story as well. So I was amused actually this week when Charles Arthur actually brought to my attention a piece by Howard French that just came out October 10th in the Los Angeles Times of this year, an op-ed. He was the former New York Times reporter on Haiti. And he writes this week that he covered the country for 4 years in the early 1990s, and a phrase that sometimes slipped into my coverage and appears to this day in other writing served as a kind of code to condense the country's history in brief journalistic shorthand. It also rendered Haiti's real story invisible and took Western powers and people off the hook. That phrase was poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, Howard, you finally seen the light. As true as this was in narrowly factual terms, he goes on to write how it told us nothing about, the way in which Haiti gave a gift to American geography, that is the Louisiana Purchase, and the fierce opposition to Haitian freedom that was mounted by the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And it reduces the crippling indemnity, right, that France imposed on Haiti in 1825 before Paris or any of the world powers would recognize the nation's independence. And it ignores the history of deep American interference in Haiti's affairs, including the military occupation. So now even the mainstream press are on board with this, and the story actually publishes this map of the Louisiana Purchase, showing all the territory that we gained as a result of Haiti's victory over Napoleon, right? It was the defeat of Napoleon during the Haitian Revolution that brought the Louisiana Purchase and the vast wealth that it generated, of course, by plantation slavery in the Mississippi Valley. And King Cotton then also fueled the Industrial Revolution in England. So, reminder, Haiti was the first republic to abolish slavery and welcome all people of African heritage as free citizens. Haiti was more democratic in the 19th century than the United States. Okay, controversial statement, but when people say Haiti has had no democracy until the election of Aristide, like that was the beginning of their democratic transition, I say, excuse me, wrong. The Haitian Revolution was the beginning of democratization. That Haiti enfranchised and gave citizenship to a wider, diverse array of people than the United States in the 19th century. Haiti also enshrined more rights to women in the 19th century, right? In the 1830s, in the 1840s, in the 1850s, women could own property. They could sign contracts and wills and bequeath property. They could not in the United States. So when we talk about where did democracy come from, my whole argument in Democracy After Slavery was that it came from the revolution against slavery. It came from the subsequent peasant movements, which called for all people to be free and to be, recognized as full human beings. So, as they say in Haiti, all people are people, right? Tout monde, c'est monde. And this is what we often forget when we talk about this sort of understanding of Haiti and the history. So with that understood background, that sort of historical background, I next want to speak briefly about when disaster strikes. And here I want to refer to the January 2010 earthquake. We know the broad outlines of it: 7.0 magnitude earthquake centered in Léogâne, 230,000 plus, we don't know, people perished, 300,000 people injured, and 1.5 million people left homeless. And, let me just say, may those people's spirits rest in peace, because they were never given funeral rites. They were never laid to rest. The horror of all of that is before us. Then, 9 months later, UN troops from Sri Lanka introduced cholera at their base, which led to another 10,000 or more deaths, 750,000 people suffering from cholera infections. Then we know, of course, on top of that, the problems with post-disaster recovery, the limitations in the coordination and effectiveness of the international response, and the billions of dollars promised, little of which reached the people. And when you hear, I still hear American media today talk about, despite all the billions of dollars in aid that were given to Haiti after the earthquake, look what's happening now. Well, that money never made it to the people in need. Very, very little of it did. So I was there in March 2010 as part of this National Science Foundation funded research project called Supporting Haitian Infrastructure, Reconstruction with Local Knowledge. I was working with a team of engineers from my university at the time, Drexel University, and we were based in Léogâne, and we trained a team of 6 Haitian university students, pictured on the bottom left here, who conducted surveys over 5 days in the entire area surrounding Léogâne. And we did semi-structured interviews with local people affected by the earthquake, with NGOs, with government officials, with the water authority, DINEPA. And we held a one-day workshop with 76 participants who represented 40 different local community-based organizations. So there were organizations of paysans, organizations of women, femmes, organizations of young people, organizations, all different types that you wouldn't, outsiders had heard nothing about. No money was being given directly to fund any of these organizations. These were the people on the ground who were doing the work of recovery and rebuilding and making a difference. And it was this experience that I reflected on really over a decade of really kind of thinking about what was going on there, what was happening. I wasn't given research funding to actually research the process. I mean, the funding was for the engineers to learn about water and sanitation needs, but I was kind of observing it as a sociologist. And what I observed were meetings like this, where you see a bunch of French and German and British NGO workers a WASH cluster meeting, that's the Water and Sanitation Group, meeting at a UN base that was fenced, fortified, and closed off from outside participants. And you see only 2 or 3 Haitian participants at this meeting. Meetings were conducted in French and English, not in Creole. Nothing was translated into Creole. Normal Haitians could not get to these meetings, at least the ones that I observed at that time. And this was typical of the sort of NGO disaster industrial complex, as some people call it. And at the workshop that we held, we were trying to work in Creole to be inclusive of all the community-based organizations and to understand how local people deliberated amongst themselves, voted on ideas, discussed them further, and then came up with a list of what they thought needed to be done in terms of, this was focused on water and sanitation. And so this is all just to say that there was a real disconnect between the capacities and the organization of Haitians on the ground and the outside world's portrayal of the victims of this disaster, and that they needed to be rescued, right, by outside NGOs. If money had gone directly to these people and these kinds of organizations, there would have been a far more successful recovery effort. So what, I've, in the immediate sort of learning from that disaster response and recovery, the idea from the engineering point of view was that infrastructure that's designed and implemented by outsiders marginalizes or demoralizes the intended beneficiaries. And that participation of local stakeholders in conceptualization, design of infrastructure, funding of infrastructure, and so on, their stake in it is really important to the outcomes and increases the likelihood that these investments will directly address local needs and capacities. So participatory design and engineering can enable co-construction, not just of things, but of meaning and the sharing of information and understanding, generating a kind of social learning. And it was really important in that transition from emergency relief to post-disaster reconstruction that we should have involved that local community knowledge, skills, and capacity to support long-term sustainability and social equity and reduce social vulnerability and future risk. So that's just to give an overview of that kind of work that I was doing in 2010 up until 2012, and really brought me to reflect in the book Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. I kind of tell some of the stories from that work and subsequent work, and think about what Linda Pulido has called racially uneven vulnerability and death, the way in which subsequent hurricanes, et cetera, have had these impacts on the Caribbean region, and why the typical disaster discourse needs to be widened and revised and rethought in multiple ways. And I draw also on the work of Yarimar Bonilla, a Puerto Rican anthropologist, who wrote about a post-Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico, that vulnerability is not simply a product of natural conditions, it's a political state and a colonial condition. So when I talk about moving beyond disaster discourse, it means that we need to go back to that political history, that colonial condition, coloniality ongoing, and to address what responsibility do we, particularly for myself in the US, what do we bear responsibility for as one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, as well as our role in colonialism, slavery, resource extraction, and then the political interference that I've already talked about. So the question should not just be one of climate adaptation. And here I show on the left a picture from a subsequent research project, which was on the flooding of Lac Azue and Lac Anguirquillo and the Dominican Haitian border, these two very large lakes, were flooding and because of climate change. And the question is not just one of climate adaptation, but climate justice and climate debt. Should major contributors to global warming pay for rebuilding, reparations, and restitution after these kinds of events? And in particular, when Hurricane Dorian hit the whole region in 2019, we saw again, in terms of that racially uneven vulnerability and death, that it was Haitian migrants and Haitian Bahamians who are one of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in the Bahamas who were most affected by Hurricane Dorian. And as Angelique Nixon wrote at the time, it's likely that many undocumented Haitian migrants have been fearful to seek shelter, even in the midst of mandatory evacuation. And immediately after Hurricane Dorian, as early as October 4th, 2019, I have this screenshot of a message circulating on social media. Topic: eradicating illegal immigrants in the Bahamas, shanty towns down. This was at a Church of God, right? Operation Sovereign Bahamas. So there's this immediate attack that happens on migrants. And again, that's what we're seeing at the US-Mexico border because of these warped understandings and these disaster discourses, which present this like problem being that Haiti's a failed state, migrants are fleeing Haiti, they will show up in our countries and our borders, and we need to push them back. That is a path of thinking that completely misconstrues the entire history and politics of the region and the policy impacts of our own policies. So that brings me to part 3, Haitian reparations. And I'll try to move quickly. I know I want to save time for discussion. So I begin with the words of the Haiti Advocacy Coalition, which included all of the groups listed here. I won't read them all out, but as you see, strong, ongoing civil society organizations within Haiti. And after the earthquake, they published a Haitian-led reconstruction and development plan, like against the one that was being promoted by the international community. And they talked about the need for massive humanitarian aid, but also a different vision of the reconstruction process, not to break from the paradigms that dominate traditional circuits of international aid. And they said, we would hope to see the emergence of international brigades working together with our organizations in the struggle to carry out agrarian reform and an integrated urban land reform program, to help in the struggle against illiteracy and for reforestation and for the construction of new, modern, decentralized, and universal systems of education and public health. And they declared their anger at the arrival of US Marines in the country, which was described as a new military occupation. I also cite the words of the Haiti Gender Shadow Report, right, which again, was issuing a report in response to the sort of dominant, partners group, their reconstruction efforts. And they said, there's urgent need to address violence, domestic violence, labor and sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, elder abuse, and other gender-based human rights violations in the post-earthquake reconstruction process. And they've highlighted the multiple unofficial reports that already existed showing that members of the National Haitian Police and the MINUSTA, the UN peacekeeping forces, were perpetrating human rights abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence against women and children. They recommended methodical consultation with women and women's groups in every post-disaster reconstruction project and preparedness planning, strengthening camp security, shelters, and services, implementing and enforcing gender equity and anti-discrimination laws, et cetera. So again, in my own observations of the NGOs operating in Haiti, and then in subsequent reports that came out about Oxfam and about the MINUSTA troops, there was extensive sexual and gender-based violence and exploitation of women and children, girls and boys, and a whole generation of children, which are called the MINUSTA children, right, who have been left behind by those troops as well, who are currently, they're trying to sue for paternity payments, paternal support. So it's really important that I get across that a key argument is to move beyond the idea of humanitarian rescue and the kind of imagery like this problematic photograph on the right of children lining up, to get water, and who are the victims, who the NGOs are coming to rescue. And so since my work in, my PhD, which was published as Democracy After Slavery, I argued that emancipated people led the way in building alliances across the African diaspora that deeply influenced US movements for civil rights and democratization. And in subsequent books like Aluminum Dreams and Island Futures, I describe the impact of US policy in the region and how we can create more sustainable futures. And what I've come to out of that sort of, decades of work is thinking about what would Black Reconstruction in the Americas, to take W.E.B. Du Bois's title and expand it, what would it look like, right? He wrote Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880. But Reconstruction in the Americas broadly writ, what kinds of futures are imagined and entailed by post-disaster reconstructions? What would radical reconstruction in Haiti look like if it were led by the people? How can reparations for slavery, for the French debt, for the US climate debt be combined in a radical Haitian-led reconstruction of Haitian democracy, which has deep, deep roots? And I draw on work building on the Du Boisian tradition about abolition democracy, as he called it, and an abolitionist approach to climate justice, and an emphasis on reparative humanism and an anti-racist humanist approach. And that leads me to my conclusion about, okay, given the power of these disaster discourses, how can we imagine Haitian futures now? And I'll try to wrap this up in just a few minutes. And I call this towards a conclusion as ouverture, right, as an opening rather than a closing. And I show the titles, covers of my book on Black peasants and peasant radicalism was a comparison of Haiti and Jamaica, and I tried to combine the imagery from the Haitian flag with the tree of liberty in the middle, with the sort of Pan-African colors that are often associated also with Jamaica, right? The green, gold, and red. And in the cover of my book, Island Futures, this detail from a beautiful artwork by Haitian artist Edouard Duval-Carrier of the Loire being transported, across the ocean. Kind of, they look like they're in search of roots, right? They're bringing Grand Bois with them, and they're looking for somewhere to put themselves, to place themselves. And that tree, it's interesting to think about the sort of French liberty tree in the flag compared to this tree who is a Loire in this other image. So in thinking about Caribbean futurity more broadly, like Haitian and the wider region, I've been inspired by Sylvia Winter's work on thinking about the human after man, on Micheline Critchlow and Patricia Northover, who have written about the vexed temporality of the present imagined as ongoing states of emergency. I think of geographer Catherine McKittrick's work on Black geographies and her interrogation of demonic grounds, which is in conversation with Sylvia Winter's work. Aaron Kamagish's recent book, Beyond Coloniality, which thinks about Caribbean political projects in the current moment, and to imagine alternative post-development futures for the entire region that will be more resilient and flexible, that will allow for movement in the hurricane season, for food sovereignty and security, for protection of water sources, protection of coastal areas and fisheries, of mangroves and coral reefs, and the replanting and reseeding of both to make more resilient ecologies. And within that, I think we learned so much about climate justice and just recovery and reparations from those very Haitian civil society organizations who have been working for years to sow the seeds for a grassroots revival, as another 1999 Haiti briefing put it. and to work with ideas about food sovereignty. So Haitians were involved with Via Campesina, the Haitian peasant movements, who said that food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. It prioritizes local economies and markets and strengthens family farmer-driven agricultural and traditional foodways, etc. I think of the work here of Haitian agronomist Georges Anglade, who also talked about this kind of food sovereignty and traditions within Haiti, who sadly died in the earthquake. And that food sovereignty does not negate trade, but it promotes the formulation of trade policies and practices that serve the rights of peoples to safe, healthy, and ecologically sustainable production. And I think of the work of Jean Casimir on the counter-plantation and how we must help break the cycle of extractive economies, fossil fuel dependence and tourism dependence, labor exploitation and unsustainability. We must reject the Caribbean as a logistics hub where nature becomes global infrastructure. And we can learn from agroecological projects how to expand Haitian and wider Caribbean food sovereignty through regenerative conservation agriculture, through multi-strata agroforestry, silvopasture, tree intercropping, tropical staple trees, multi-crop gardening in the system that the Arawaks called Canuco, and the resilient root crops that are the basis of that, known as cassava, or in other places, yucca. So these are visions for building just recovery, not just in Haiti, but for example, in Puerto Rico, where thousands of people came together after Hurricanes Irma and Maria to build a holistic plan for a resilient, thriving society in an era of accelerating climate crisis. And again, identifying that the problem, the crisis, is the way in which the island's people and land have been treated like a bottomless raw resource for the mainland to mine for over a century. So this kind of vision requires mobilization, and we saw international solidarity with Haiti in 2021. At that time, with the election of the Biden administration, the movements were demanding that the Biden administration end its support for Jovenel Moise, withdraw from participation in Haiti's phony constitutional process, stop interfering in the internal affairs of Haiti, stop deporting Haitians who are fleeing their country, right? These were demands of March 2021. Then, of course, Moise was assassinated, as we know, in July, and the Haitian, migration crisis or humanitarian reception crisis intensified in September. So we need to combine historical reparations for slavery, reparations for the indemnity that Haiti was made to pay to France and to the United States, and for modern climate debt. We need a robust political language, as Wainwright and Mann put it, defending the right of people to migrate in anticipation of climate change. And not only to migrate, but also the right to dwell, to protect one's home, to repair loss and damages. How is the claim for payment of reparations for slavery and for the indemnity that Haiti paid related to climate change and the case for climate reparations today? Can we make potential financing for climate reparations linked to long-term loss and damages experienced by communities that were exposed to enslavement, colonial plantation economies, resource extraction, and ongoing debt and vulnerability? And I believe that's the kind of argument we need to be making. And that's why I end by saying this is not a requiem. Haiti and the Haitian dream are not over. The Haitian Revolution is not over. It continues, it lives on, and I support this revindication of Haitian futures in the name and in the spirit of Dessalines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Scheller, for an excellent presentation. I think we all appreciated how you divided up the presentation into telling the history of Haiti's importance, not only in the region, but on a global level, and also explaining the various ways and various countries that, that owe a debt to Haiti. And I think also I particularly appreciated, because of my research on reparations in the region, with Haiti being one of the cases, where you spoke to the theme of reparations and really this bringing into conversation how Haitian civil societies are actually constructing their own visions, reimagining and rethinking, what their futures look like and how they can move forward. So thank you very much for that excellent presentation. In the chat function, I don't see any questions at the moment. Is there anyone that would like to raise their hand and ask a question, or perhaps write to me directly if you wish to remain anonymous? So going to be a brave soul who's going to ask the first question. There we go. There's Eve. Thanks, Eve.
Yeah, I thought I'd kick it off, and hopefully other people can jump in. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It brought back a lot of memories. I've said this before on a couple of occasions, but I think one of the things that resonated, one of the memories that I took from the Haiti earthquake that really, really changed the course, really, I think, of my thinking and kind of where I am today, really, in terms of the need for a complete overhaul, basically, of our understanding of the humanitarian sector, and how it needs to just basically start from scratch, because it's not working, and it's such an extractive and exploitative and problematic sector. But I just something that really resonated with me was being sat with a UN so-called peacekeeper at the time, who openly admitted that they were instructed to prioritise the buildings where white people, where Leblanc were trapped inside, and that was a direct. Basically, they were instructed to ignore the screams of Haitians under the rubble, and to prioritise anybody who was there from overseas. And I think that really just the shock of that, of just understanding like the value of Black Haitian bodies, and the fact that people were treated with such by the very supposed sector that's supposed to that claims to be protecting them, but really is doing the exact opposite. And that was just something I wanted to share, really, with the group, was those kind of memories of it just being just so harrowing, not just what happened with the earthquake, but also the destructive impact, really, of international people who were there, and the bad decisions that they made. And the other thing I wanted to say as well, because this was the Clinton take on this, was very much, pushing forward. I wanted to know your views on this Building Back Better discourse as well. And I say that because that is the exact quote for quote, word for word, what our government is now pushing forward post-COVID. They're talking about building back better the UK, and the lessons that we can learn from Haiti, and the absolute disaster that was in itself, I think, is something that we can learn from. So that was just, it's not really a question, but it's more just a couple of observations while more people put their hand.
No, thank you. And when I completely agree with your observations, and when I was reflecting on the NGO response, let's call it, after the earthquake, I mean, the first thing is that, I mean, the US military, first of all, took control of the airport, right? The Toussaint Louverture airport, which they insist on calling the, Port-au-Prince airport without naming it. But they they blocked aid flights from landing, right? We know, right, that immediately their priority was to bring in military and security supplies, right? Not to bring in aid to the people. That's number one. And we know, that Médecins Sans Frontières, right, have, filed complaints immediately that they were unable to land aid. And secondly, that the Build Back Better is BS, right? It was then, it may be now, right? What was built back, right? What was built? Hotels were built. Caracol Industrial Park was built, destroying farmland, right? Interest was stoked up in large plantation agricultural sort of land grabs by the likes of Coca-Cola. Hillary Clinton's brother or brother-in-law was fishing around for gold mining operations, right, in the northern Massif. The things that were done had nothing to do with building back better for the Haitian people, for the Haitian economy within itself. It was more extraction. And so when we hear people talk about Build Back Better today, be careful what's being built, who's building it, and who's it for. And that, we learned that from Haiti, but it happens across the world. I see a number of other hands up, so let me take some other questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for those comments, Eve, and that response there, Professor Scheller. I'm going to start with the order that I see. So at the moment, that is Angela, Rachel, Kate, and then Paul. So let's start with Angela, please.
Thanks so much, Mimi, for this amazing talk. And I have to say, I think I read your book over Christmas last year when we were in lockdown in the UK, and it kind of was, I couldn't put it down the whole time, partly also because I couldn't go outside. But it's a fantastic book. And I just want to bring together two things that you mentioned. You very rightly highlight the kind of structural violence that's embedded and circulates with this colonial idea of humanitarian rescue. And you also look to Black Reconstruction and transatlantic exchanges of ideas and knowledge between Haitians and Black Americans as an important site for reflecting and reimagining Haiti's futures. So I just wanted to ask, how does the discourse of abolition or defunding structures of racial and institutional violence apply to the NGO industrial complex? Can we ever get to reparations being a more tangible ideal as long as we have the NGO industrial complex obstructing more radical discourses and benefiting from the commodification of disasters and poverty? Or do we need to sort of think about defunding international humanitarianism as a means towards a more radical future?
Great question, Angela. Thank you for that. And yes, absolutely. And it's interesting. I did not use that terminology at the time that I was writing the book, but abolition, right? Abolition of the NGO humanitarian industrial complex would be a good way to put the lessons learned, right? Which is that so much of the donations and the money given were extracted into overhead costs, let's call it, or as I reflected on my own research teams, our travel, right? Our airline tickets, our rental car, our place to stay, our electricity, our mobile phone plans and international, data connections, our eating of food that was, being cooked locally on charcoal, all of that impact that we had on the Haitian recovery economy, right, distorts it. It distorts it towards serving our needs, not the needs of the victims of the earthquake, right? So there's a huge problem in how the NGO complex works. And part of my arguments about mobility justice are, that it had this islanding effect. That is, we were mobile, we were able to be there to do things, to get resources, and it was all towards the purpose of islanding Haiti, entrapping people there, not letting them migrate. That was the biggest concern of the foreign, powers, was that they did not want Haitians to leave the disaster zone. They wanted to keep them there. That's what all of that work is all about. And it should be abolished for sure.
Great question, Angela, and excellent response, Professor Scheller. Thank you. Let's go to Rachel.
Yes, thanks, Mimi, for that wonderful paper. And like Angela, I read your book in, I think, a single sitting, also during the lockdown period. And with all the talk about mobility and, not allowed to move and this sort of thing, I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in the book, which is rassemblage, as articulated by Gina Athena Ulysse. So I wondered if you could say more about that, and also the songs for the Vaudoullois, which structure the book so well.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So Gina Athena Ulysse is a, inspiration to so many of us. She's incredible. For those who don't know her, she's a, Haitian anthropologist and artist and practitioner of many things. And I've known her since I was had a postdoc at the Center for African and Afro-American Studies at University of Michigan, and she was there finishing her PhD. So that's been many years that we've known each other. We're friends, and her work inspired me to really explore more the spiritual aspects of the work we do. And so I do bring that into, as I was writing the book, as I was finishing the book, my mother had just died, and I felt this very close connection, I guess, to the spiritual world. And I had dreams, and I understood those, I interpreted them, and I asked advice from people like Gina, from people like Patrick Bellegarde-Smith, right? People who I knew for many years. And I said, can I write about this? What does this mean? Is it okay for me? Patrick, reassuringly said the lois do not discriminate. The lois are universal. So if they come to you, if they speak to you, listen. And so in listening to that and taking that advice, I felt secure enough to let go of my, in a sense, my need to write an authoritative, analysis and write a book that would have these sort of endings where I tied up all the strings, right, and sort of presented my argument, and instead say, well, actually, no, these chapters are actually each inspired by these lois, and I use the songs to indicate that, to let them speak at the end, and to say the learning that I'm doing, that I'm writing about, is coming through these generational histories of learning and knowing, and give recognition where it's due to the loi.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Kate?
Thank you, Mimi, for that wonderful paper as well. I just wanted to pick up on something you said at the very end there, which was the theme of reparations. I declare an interest, as I have the honor of supervising Shodona's thesis on reparations. So I wanted to ask if you're aware if there are Haitian individuals, or more significantly, I guess, grassroots organizations who are currently making that case for what you outlined at the end, that is the linking of historical reparations with modern climate debt. Or, is most of the bandwidth for mobilization now taken up with the very immediate political and security crisis post the assassination of Moise? Because it always seems, these visions for reimagined futures are born out of crisis, but also in the immediacy of that crisis, it must kind of squeeze out the opportunity to mobilize around anything other than the very immediate political crisis at hand.
Yeah, I mean, just for full disclosure, right? My knowledge of the current political situation and crisis is third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand, right? Between the security situation and COVID, I have not traveled to Haiti in several years. And so, you know, I can take what I glean from others and try to make, you know, my assessment of that. But it's a devastating situation and incredible turmoil and violence at the moment with the kidnappings, right? And ongoing, and the assassination, and the way in which the group who are, you know, called the core group, right, are seen as backing these leaders. That is, the ambassadors from US, Canada, Brazil, EU, UN, and the OAS are controlling, you know, pulling the strings, right, politically behind the scenes. And so, you know, there's that immediacy of, okay, when what's going to happen now with Ariel Henry in power, with this travel hold that was placed against him because of his possible involvement with the organizers of the assassination, with Joseph Félix Badiou from the Justice Ministry, who's accused of planning the assassination and being in these phone conversations with Henri, with the roundup of the Colombian mercenaries, et cetera. I mean, there's always drama, right? Immediate drama. But given that terrible situation, I believe organizations, both grassroots in Haiti organizations and diaspora organizations, are still committed to a vision beyond like the immediacy of now, right? They're still committed to a vision of reparation in a very broad sense, right, of Haiti. And I'm not there on the ground, though, to say who and what is doing that. Maybe some of you are.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Paul, I see a hand up from Paul Sutton.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Mimi. I echo all the others. If I can, in saying a great presentation, can I just say something about what Kate just asked? I spent the last couple of days, I'm talking to you from Glasgow, and I spent the last couple of days trying to find out what the Caribbean, in the organisation of states which represent small island developing states, and others are doing for this coming conference. And as far as I can see, no one has linked reparations with demands. In fact, it's very difficult to find out what they're actually asking for the conference at the moment. So that's an issue which, if I'm going to go to one or two things at the conference, which I hope to do, I would certainly put my hand up and try and raise physically as well as now with you online. But I want to just make something about recent developments in Haiti. I noticed that Dan Foote, who was the special envoy to Haiti by the Biden administration, recently resigned. And he resigned because he didn't approve of the policy of deportation, which he described as deeply flawed, inhumane, and counterproductive. And he also pointed out that what he saw as the future were two things which really echo what you were trying to say. And I always think that this may be a sinner who repenteth is something we should all rejoice in. And I say that because what he said was, the future of Haiti belongs to the grassroots organizations. And out of the two sets of grassroots organizations, the one that he favored was the Commission for Haitian Solution to the Crisis, who are the present grassroots organization, I think, which represent the more radical forces there. On the other hand, the Americans are trying to put together another set of grassroots organization, and that was made clear in the meeting of the Security Council on the 4th of October this year, where the UN put forward their backing behind the Americans on backing this other set of grassroots. So the obvious thing that we need to ask is, can the grassroots organizations get together again like they did in 1986 overthrow Duvalier, because that certainly seems to me to be a first precondition. And the second one, which is the role of migrants. You, I think, correctly point out that Haiti needs to be built from the bottom up, not from the top down. And migrants currently contribute 37% to the GDP of Haiti in the last figures, if you trust World Bank figures. 37% is pretty high. It's the second highest in the world after Tonga. So more money needs to come into Haiti from the migrants, from the bottom up. So isn't one of the ways we can develop Haiti for you in America to agitate for 1 million green cards for Haitians?
Yes. So absolutely. So I mean, it's interesting, first of all, what you said about America and the UN and the Security Council trying to back another set of grassroots organizations, because that's also what happened in the past, right? Is that they set up conflicts between groups. And so you have this long history of, again, a kind of interference and disorganization of grassroots mobilization and solidarity, right? By trying to co-opt some or push out some. And also, I would also say behind the scenes, right, is what we could call the narco economy, right? The massive role of the US in the control and manipulation of the supply chains of the drug trade across the Caribbean and Latin America. And, you know, that's feeding into our consumer markets here. And also the weapons, right, and the gun trade, and where's all the weaponry coming from, and all the training of the different mercenaries and the so-called gangs that are controlling things. So that's just to say our fingerprints are all over that too. All that dysfunctionality has US fingerprints on it. And so, yeah, it would be great if the grassroots organizations could get back together. And this goes back to Kate's question about rassemblage, right? Which I forgot to address, right? So Rachel, rassemblage is this kind of convening together of the people and of spirits and of a kind of gathering of forces. And that's where the strength in Haiti lies, right? If Haitians can assemble that kind of unity and that inspiration, that would be wonderful. And yes, remittances can play a huge part in that, and the migration issue. And what I would argue for is that there should be much easier possibility for back and forth movement, right? The reason the remittance economy exists is in part because those who are able to migrate and make it to a functioning economy, right, are only able to send back money. And it's very hard for people to easily circulate back and forth. And if there was more circulation, not just of goods, but of people, the Haitian economy would function better. And alongside that, if the embargo on Cuba was lifted, right, imagine if the Cuban economy could be integrated more into the wider Caribbean economies, right? So that trade between Haiti and Cuba could occur again in more successful ways. There's many different ways to think about that circuits of trade, of migrants, of remittances that could all be addressed if we had better policy thinkers and understandings, right, at work and in the US. And I'm glad that Dan Foote, resigned and made those statements. Good for him. It's about time somebody did that. And I'm glad Howard French came clean, as well. I'm glad President Clinton, apologized for his role in the rice, import policies that affected Haiti in the 1990s. All of these people may have, come clean on their role in this, but we still are not seeing positive policy directions emerge. So we need greater leadership there to sort of put those on the table. And I would call on the Haitian diaspora communities to lay out the policy agenda that would be more successful for the region and for Haiti.
Thank you very much for those questions we just had and your responses, Professor Scheller. I'm going to combine two questions that we have before we wrap up in the next 10 minutes. And they're quite similar. The first one is by Marietta Morrissey. And then I'm going to combine the other questions. So it's, I suppose, about the... So the question we have here from Marietta is, can the massive number of global North-led NGOs and humanitarian efforts be transformed into some kind of solidarity movement supporting the Haitian grassroots efforts? So what are the ways in which you see, NGOs that have been in Haiti, that are in Haiti, be transformed into more progressive development strategies aligning to civil society organization, and what they want? And the second question then is, whether perhaps this international solidarity, how that could also be envisioned for reparations and a form of climate justice.
Yeah. Oh, right. Good point. And also this speaks to part of Paul's question as well about the Glasgow COP conference. Let me take that second part first, just to say that. So I've been in conversation with and worked with the University of the West Indies Institute for Reparations Studies, headed by Vereen Shepherd, and of course the British West Indies have been working towards that historical reparations argument, reparations for slavery, and that can be. And I argued for linking that to the climate reparations case, right? So the slavery reparations case and the climate reparations case. And it's interesting that we don't see that being brought forward right now. And Hilary Beckles, has been a strong advocate of the slavery reparations case and trying to sort of get that on the political agenda. And it's been done in only very small ways. Thank you, University of Glasgow, for example, for their role in that. But it has not been taken on by the wider political leadership. But I do see it gaining momentum, right? And I think that by tying it to the climate reparations case, it can gain even more momentum, because we can see these direct legacies, right, of slavery and plantation economies that created this what I call the coloniality of climate change. That is, who is most vulnerable to it now? Who are the harmed communities right now? And who are the contributors to climate change? And it directly maps onto the history of plantation slavery and the transatlantic slave system. So those who benefited from that are those who went through the Industrial Revolution, who then became the fossil fuel dependent economies, who then contributed to greenhouse gases, right? That then hurts those people. So there's a clear argument that needs to be laid out, I think, to make that case. And I think that should be on the Glasgow agenda. It's a shame the governments have not gotten, and their representatives have not gotten to that point yet. Maybe next time around, if we keep working on this argument. And then the other part of the question, now I've gotten myself distracted. All right. This is about the solidarity movements, right? And here, I'm incredibly thankful to the experience I had with my mother's generation and with the solidarity movements that they brought, which were transnational feminist solidarity movements in the 1980s and into the 90s and onward, which built, people-to-people connections, things like, and study tours, right? Like I did with the Haiti support group, that kind of people-to-people connection where you actually meet people. Either you go there and meet them, or you invite them when they are visiting your country to speak at your organization. Well, that's how the anti-slavery movement, took root, for goodness sakes, right? Is hearing directly from the people. and what their analysis is, what their experience is, what their recommendations are, and then amplifying that information. So of course, the NGOs and humanity efforts should instead be working as solidarity movements and should be amplifying the voice of the people going through whatever that experience might be, whether it's in Haiti or it's in another country. And we have all these resources for communication and for getting the word out and for inviting people to events like this. Like, yes, absolutely, we should be listening to Haitians, inviting Haitian speakers and hearing directly, what their analysis of their own situation is and what their demands are.
Fantastic, thank you. And Ainwa, I think you had a question or a comment, the director of CLACS. We'd love to hear from you just to wrap things up.
Hi, thanks. Thank you so much, Mimi. Actually, what I was going to ask is partly related to the first question you were talking about in terms of basically historical debt and the need for historical reparation to address that. And I was thinking about how can that be done, or how is that being done? And I guess I was going to ask, can we think of a transitional justice mechanism or a model based on truth commissions or other processes whereby past atrocities have been addressed that can serve as a model, or that are being or are serving as a model, or that can brought lessons for how to address these? And can that be done in a way that is not further imposing ways of framing what the problem is on Haiti and other similar settings? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not that well versed in truth and reconciliation commissions. I mean, I know of some, right, of the South African case, and the indigenous peoples movements at the moment are very inspiring. And in certain circumstances, in certain places, kind of transitional justice, truth commissions, and so on, have been effective in some ways. I have not thought through whether that would be what is needed in terms of Haiti. I mean, I do feel like we have so much ignorance in the global north, in the US, in Europe, about what the actual history is. And so, I mean, not to be such a professor, but like, thank you, all of you historians and anthropologists and, others out there who are bringing this history to the world and teaching our students. I think we need to teach. We need to teach. Teaching is important, and learning the history is important. Whether that would come through a truth commission, I don't know. Yeah, I would need to think about that more and how successful those are. And but certainly some level of greater knowledge of our history is needed, and the way we teach our own history. So, like, we need to take responsibility in Britain, in the US, in France. How do we teach that history? And what are the ways in which, by teaching it more holistically and from an African point of view, from a Haitian point of view, in terms of the history of the slave trade and so on. And so many writers have done so much, and artists have done so much to sort of bring that forward. That might help us maybe get to a point where there's more understanding, right, amongst journalists, amongst politicians, amongst policymakers, amongst ambassadors, all these people who are like doing all of this interfering. If they were better informed, maybe we could change things. Yeah. So thank you for Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for the work you do.
Exactly. Well, I think that was an excellent note to wrap up on. Professor Shella, you have raised numerous things for us to think about. For those of us who study the Caribbean, study Haiti, history, what have you, all of these elements converge. And And I think an important organization for us to continue to observe and see what's happening on the ground is that the Haitian Commission for a Haitian Solution to the Crises. You can follow the group on Twitter, because really I think, as Professor Scheller was saying in her presentation, the grassroots voices are the voices that need to be heard. And this coalition also includes different political factions as well. So it's commissioned to hear all the voices of Haiti, with the majority being from civil society. And just to add there that Haiti did attempt at a truth commission back when Aristide was president, to account for or to listen to the truths of human rights violations that happened during the dictatorship. So who knows, perhaps that could happen. Let's wait and see what happens on the ground in Haiti. I would like to thank everyone for turning up and listening to this excellent presentation that we had from Professor Scheller, and thank you to CLACS for putting together this Caribbean Studies seminar series and for inviting me to chair this excellent session. And thank you all for your questions and comments as well. The next event is on the 16th of November, so do tune in, turn up, and ask your excellent questions again. I believe the recording will be shared at a later date, so also keep an eye out on the YouTube channel for CLACS. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again to Professor Scheller. Please do use the reactions for the clapping, or you can do a silent Zoom clap. Thank you again for your excellent presentation.
Thank you, Shodona, for excellent hosting of the event, and to everybody who organized the seminar. Thanks again, and thanks to the audience for being here.